There's a subtle shift that happens after life settles. It's not something you decide. It's not something you practice. It's something you notice after it's already been happening. You stop checking. Not completely, not all at once, but the constant background habit of checking. Checking how you feel, checking how you're doing, checking whether something is wrong, checking whether you're okay. It starts to loosen, and you don't celebrate it. You don't even really notice it at first. You just realize later on that you didn't ask. You didn't pause the moment to evaluate it. You didn't scan your inner state before responding. You didn't run a quick audit to see if you were aligned, present, aware, or off track. You just responded, and the world didn't collapse. That's usually when the habit of checking reveals itself, when it doesn't happen and nothing bad follows. For a long time, checking felt like responsibility, like care, like attentiveness, like maturity. You check your emotions so they don't get out of control. You check your thoughts so you don't miss something important. You check your reactions so you don't become someone you don't want to be. Checking felt like staying awake, but it also created a quiet tension, because checking implies something might be wrong. It assumes there's a correct internal state you should be in, and that you're responsible for finding it. So the mind keeps a finger on the pulse. How am I right now? Is this okay? Is this normal? Should I feel different? Should I be further along? Those questions don't always feel anxious. Sometimes they feel neutral, even reasonable. But over time, they create distance. You're no longer just living your life. You're monitoring it. And monitoring requires separation. Someone has to watch. Someone has to evaluate. And that someone quietly becomes you. Not as a person, as a position. A watcher inside your own life. In this phase, that position starts to dissolve. Not because you argued it away. Not because you proved it unnecessary. But because life kept happening without it. You answered a question without checking your tone. You made a decision without checking your alignment. You felt irritation without checking what it meant about you. And nothing needed correcting. The checking was late, or absent, and that absence didn't feel reckless. Felt easier. You might still notice the habit pop up sometimes. A familiar urge to pause and assess. A reflex to step outside the moment and evaluate it. That's okay. Habits don't vanish just because they're no longer needed. They fade. And fading looks uneven. Some days you check more. Some days you don't. But something important has shifted. Checking is no longer compulsory. It's optional. And most of the time, unnecessary. This doesn't mean you stop caring. That's a common fear. If I stop checking myself, will I stop being considerate? If I stop monitoring my reactions, will I become careless? If I stop evaluating my inner state, will I miss something important? But notice what's actually happening. You still notice when you're tired. You still notice when something hurts. You still notice when you've said something off. You just don't need to turn those moments into investigations. You don't need to hold court. Fatigue can just be fatigue. Irritation can just be irritation. A mistake can just be a mistake. Nothing else needs to be layered on top. That's what changes. The second layer falls away. The layer where you decide what the experience means about you. The layer where you decide whether you're doing life correctly. The layer where every moment becomes feedback. Without that layer, things move faster. Not rushed. Unstuck. You don't pause the day to consult yourself. You don't interrupt movement to check the map. You just move. And again, this is subtle. From the outside, nothing dramatic changes. You still go to work. You still have conversations. You still feel things. But internally, there's less friction, less interruption. The mind still comments sometimes. But the commentary doesn't stop the action. You don't wait for clarity to respond. You don't wait for certainty to speak. You don't wait for emotional resolution to take the next step. You speak. You act. You move. And if understanding shows up later, fine. If it doesn't, also fine. Because understanding isn't required for participation. That's a hard truth for a mind that learned to survive by staying alert, by checking constantly, by scanning for danger, error, or misalignment. That habit wasn't a flaw. It was protection. But protection doesn't need to run forever. When the environment changes, the nervous system adjusts. And that's what's happening here. Life feels less like a test, less like a performance, less like something you could fail if you're not paying close attention. You don't need to watch yourself breathe. Breathing happens. You don't need to supervise every interaction. Connection still occurs. You don't need to audit your feelings. They still move. That's not neglect. That's trust. Not trust in an idea. Trust in life's basic functioning. You may notice something else. Silence changes. Not outer silence. Inner space. There's more room between thoughts. Not because you force them away, but because you're not checking for them. When you stop scanning for mental activity, the mind naturally quiets. Not empty, just less crowded. Thoughts come and go without needing response. You don't have to agree with them. You don't have to correct them. You don't have to follow them. They're just there, like sounds in a room. And because you're not checking constantly, attention widens. You notice what's around you again. The physical world. Light, movement, sound, temperature. You're less absorbed in commentary, more embedded in context. That doesn't feel spiritual. It feels practical. You notice when to slow down. You notice when to speak up. You notice when something needs doing. Not because you analyzed it, because you were present enough to respond. Checking often masquerades as presence. But presence doesn't require monitoring. It requires contact. And contact happens when you're not split between living and evaluating. That split has been closing, quietly, without announcement. You may notice you're harder to pull into abstract conversations about yourself. Questions like, how are you really doing? Where are you at with everything? What phase do you feel like you're in? They don't land the same way. Not because you're hiding, but because there's nothing to summarize. You're just living. Any answer would feel artificial, too neat, too representational. So you answer simply, fine, okay. Getting through the week, same as usual, and you mean it, because usual is no longer a problem to solve. Usual is life. That can disappoint people who expect depth to look intense, who expect insight to sound dramatic. But depth doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes depth looks like stability. Sometimes it looks like not needing to talk about yourself. Sometimes it looks like not checking whether you're still on track. You might even forget, for stretches of time, that you ever worried about these things, that you ever analyzed yourself so closely, that you ever needed to know what everything meant. Then something reminds you, a conversation, a memory, quiet moment, and you realize how different it feels now. Not lighter in a euphoric way, but less tight, less guarded, less watched. And the body knows the difference. The body relaxes when it's not being evaluated. It settles when it's not being judged. It moves more fluidly when it's not being corrected mid-movement. That's why this phase feels more embodied, less head-centered. You feel hunger and eat. You feel tired and rest. You feel interest and follow it, without turning those movements into statements, without checking if they're allowed. This is where autonomy returns, not as independence, but as natural self-regulation. You don't need rules to tell you when to stop. You don't need principles to tell you when to act. Life cues itself. That doesn't mean you always get it right. It means right is no longer the standard. Responsiveness is, you respond to what's here, then you move on. No review necessary. And when checking does appear, because it will sometimes, you may notice it differently. It feels like a habit passing through, not a command. You don't have to obey it. You don't have to suppress it either. You can let it do what habits do when they're no longer needed. Fade. This is not about becoming passive. You still make decisions. You still take responsibility. You still set boundaries. But those actions don't require internal surveillance. They don't require you to hover over yourself. They happen from the same place breathing happens, naturally. You might even find yourself surprised by your own responses. You speak more directly. You rest more easily. You disengage sooner when something isn't working. Not because you plan to, because checking didn't slow you down. And there's something freeing about that. Not dramatic freedom, functional freedom. The freedom to not be in constant consultation with yourself. The freedom to let life lead. The freedom to trust that you'll notice what matters when it matters. That trust doesn't feel bold, feels quiet, unremarkable, which is exactly why it's real. This episode isn't about telling you to stop checking. You can't force that anyway. It's about noticing that checking is already loosening, that life doesn't need the supervision it once demanded, that you can move without commentary, that you can live without constant reference, and that nothing bad happens when you do. The world keeps turning. You keep responding. Care continues. Nothing needs to be checked, because life is already handling itself.